Hello, I am looking up the details on the cat mayors of Somerville and whether or not they will actually rule the city with an iron fist or an iron claw, as the case may be.
The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com. Today on The Horse Race, we're starting with polling in the Boston mayoral race and what it tells us about how the contest is unfolding. Then, how action in Washington could unravel our state budget here in Massachusetts. It's Thursday, July 31st. Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. A bit later on, I'll be joined by our good friend Katie Lannan from GBH News to talk budgets. But for now, I have a special guest from deep behind the tofu curtain, far into western Massachusetts. You've probably figured out by now that it's Rich Parr, Vice President to the MassINC Polling Group. Rich, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I just have to start with a question. How are things out there? They're incredibly hot and muggy out here. How are things looking out there?
They are also hot and muggy here. My younger child is at sleepaway camp this week, and we haven't heard any complaints yet, but I'm sure I'll hear a ton when they get back this Friday.
I was going to say, isn't that because they don't have their phones? Isn't that the
there's no that's the other thing. There's no screens. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work, but we haven't gotten any. There haven't been any reports of a psychotic break or anything yet, so I think we're okay.
You'll get those later. But I asked you to be on the show today for two reasons. One is that it's municipal election season, and there's some super interesting stuff happening out there in Northampton. And then there's a Boston mayoral poll. And of course, you and I go way back on the Boston mayoral polls, deep into the past on Boston mayoral elections. So we also want to talk about that. But let's start in Northampton, because you've been paying close attention to what's happening there. Of course, it's your home area. And there's an explosion of interest in running for office out there.
Yeah, there really has. There was a report that may have even made its way across the wilds of Central Mass to Eastern Mass that there are 45 people running for various offices in Northampton this election season, which is much, much higher than we normally get. Honestly, things are usually pretty sleepy here. But we've got 23 people running for various city council spots. There's many openings on our school committee this year. We've got the incumbent mayor is facing 3 different challengers. So what happens in these situations, as with Boston, is that means that you're going to have a preliminary election in September for a lot more seats than you typically would have. A lot of these contests usually just happen in November, but we suddenly have a very busy September season. So it's going to be interesting to see that kind of unfold over the next month or so here.
This feels pretty unusual because oftentimes the news stories we read are, the vast majority of local offices are unopposed. Some of them may even have no candidates. And, the leading write-in candidate is, unwittingly placed into the office. So what's happening in Northampton that is turning the tide in the other direction?
There's a few kind of hot button issues here that I think are driving people to want to run for office. And I should say, before I get into this, I should disclose that, I do know some of these candidates that are running, and I'm actually volunteering for our incumbent mayor's reelection campaign. And I know her and her husband well. But I'm going to just try to do this dispassionately with my analyst cap on. But a couple of big issues, I would say, in town that are really kind of generating a lot of debate and frankly, animosity. One of them, I think the most important one, is school funding. The public schools have been increased. They've increased funding for the public schools over the past few years, but it's still not enough in some people's eyes. And of course, we know that inflation has been a problem for the past few years. There's been federal funding that was given to the schools during the pandemic that has now gone away. So there's a host of issues with that. Northampton is not alone in this. I know that there are other communities out here in the western part of the state that are struggling with their school budget as well. But Northampton really seems to be the place where this has really become a political issue. In fact, we have this a sort of an opposition group called Support Our Schools, or SOS as they call themselves, that have actually taken the step of creating a political action committee and raising money, donations, in order to get involved on the political side on this issue. And they've raised about $25,000 so far. They say they're going to be endorsing candidates for various seats, school committee, city council, and mayor coming up. So they've really kind of supercharged, I think, some of the discussion around this, and they've brought kind of a very aggressive tone to a lot of the discussions around school funding. And in turn, we've seen a bit of a backlash against them. In fact, one of the candidates for city council, who is opposing a candidate who is supported by this group, wrote recently in the newspaper that they received the endorsement questionnaire from this group and then refused and wrote an op-ed explaining why they're not even going to bother to fill it out, because they think that this group has become too divisive and harsh in the way that their tone and their tactics around this issue. So that's a big one. School funding is a big one in Northampton right now.
And then, of course, you've also noted to me that there's a lot going on in terms of redesigning Main Street. So certainly some local issues that echo, I think, some things happening across the state in Melrose and many other places back here as well. School funding is an issue basically for the same reasons. So we'll be keeping an eye on what happens in Northampton. But then let's come back to Boston. Let's once again journey across the vast wilds of central Massachusetts to get back to Boston and look at a poll that the Boston Globe and Suffolk University put out this past week on the Boston mayoral election. So, Rich, top line is Michelle Wu is leading by a lot. Josh Kraft is trailing by a lot. But what stood out to you?
Yeah, this is not a good poll for Josh Kraft. When you're running against an incumbent, especially in Boston, in the past, Marty Walsh, Mayor Menino, they seemed to cruise to re-elections. And it seemed like once you become the mayor of Boston, it's very, very hard to unseat them. And it seems like Michelle Wu is in a position to maybe repeat some of that success here. Michelle Wu is favored over Josh Kraft by pretty much a 2-to-1 margin here. 60% would vote for Wu and 30% would vote for Kraft, and a small number for other candidates. But also, I think Michelle Wu has much better favorability ratings than Josh Kraft. She's got a 66% favorability rating. Josh Kraft is actually a little bit underwater, 36 favorable, 42% unfavorable. So he has not been able to really hurt her numbers in terms of favorability. He has not been able to successfully really introduce himself as an alternative candidate that people would be interested in. It just seems like every number in this poll is sort of is pointing towards Wu having a really strong showing, and frankly makes it tough to see Kraft getting back in this race.
Yeah, I found those name ID numbers, the favorability numbers, very interesting, because sometimes the challenge that you have running against an incumbent is you get to the end and still nobody knows who you are. We've seen that happen in statewide elections. Sometimes we've seen it happen in some local elections. But this time, Josh Kraft has managed to, to the extent that he needed to introduce himself, get his name out there, but it has not resulted in a lot of people liking him and deciding to vote for him. It's resulted in pretty much the opposite. So definitely not a good sign for him. It actually reminded me in some ways of some polling we did back in 2017 when Boston Mayor Marty Walsh was up for re-election at that time. And he was running against Tito Jackson, who, interestingly, was very well liked, even very late in the race. He had very, very strong favorables. Tito Jackson, that is, with 50% favorable and only 9% unfavorable, and still lost by 30 or 30 or so. I don't remember the exact margin. But when you're looking at Josh Kraft being underwater a little bit and, this kind of late in the game, it's certainly not where he would want to be at this point.
And we had touched on bike lanes briefly in the discussion on Northampton. So just to bring them up here again, there is one, if there's any number in this poll that was, I think, decent for Josh Kraft, it's that the survey asked folks whether their own travels around Boston had been impacted by by these bike lanes that Josh Kraft has been criticizing the Wu administration for going very aggressively on. And 50% of people did say that they thought that these lanes had made things slower and less convenient to get around. But 30% said they really hadn't been impacted one way or the other. So, that's kind of an issue that he's been hammering on. And it's kind of, there's some traction, but I wouldn't say overwhelming. And I think that kind of really typifies the situation here. 64% of people in this poll have a an approve of how Mayor Wu is doing as mayor. So it's not just her favorability; it's our actual job approval is high as well. And that one issue that the Kraft has really been trying to hammer on I'd say it's somewhat breaking through, but is it the top issue for people, right? The top issue that people cite in this poll is housing. Which has been a perennial issue now across the state. And if you look at questions related to housing in the poll, like support for rent control, for example, people are more aligned with the Wu position on that than they are with the Kraft position on that. So there's definitely, maybe a glimmer of hope on bike lanes, but it's really hard to see that really being a decisive issue that's going to bring him back in this race.
We should note, too, of course, that there are still several months to go and anything could happen. So we're not, making a prediction with this, just reading the tea leaves as they exist today. But the top issue question that you mentioned actually also reminded me of 2017, where, that's about the time frame that we really saw housing emerge as it has now become the perennial top issue. That was sort of when it first popped up to the top of polling, when in the past it had always been education, healthcare, the economy. So seeing that still up there is also quite interesting. Zooming in a little bit on education, because this is another area where Mayor Wu has been criticized as far as how BPS is doing and so forth. That's another area where the dissatisfaction with BPS is not a new thing, and it did not hamper either Mayor Menino or Mayor Walsh's reelections either. So a bit of a ways to go on this one, but not where you'd want to be if you are the Kraft campaign.
The other thing I would say, I was just looking at the numbers related to the top issue again, Stephen. So in this poll, 12%, about 13% cited schools or education. That had been a big issue in previous elections. And I remember the election that where Mayor Walsh came in initially in 2013, I think it was. That was like the top issue. And now it's kind of fallen down a little bit, and it's still, in the top 5, but it's tied with local response to Trump initiatives. And, one thing we haven't talked about yet is probably the most high profile thing that's happened in this entire campaign was Mayor Wu going down to Washington and testifying before Congress. And I think she got very strong reviews, for the way she acquitted herself with that. And I think that was really a moment that solidified kind of her position, among Democrats in this race. And I think that's an indelible moment that's gonna kind of play to her benefit, I think, going through the rest of this.
Yep, I think that's right. Unfortunately, we don't really have other numbers to compare that to. Local media budgets aren't what they were even in 2017, much less 2013 or before. So, we're not doing polling for the people that we've done it for in the past. So we might still get some more mayoral polling, but for now, this is the only one we've got. But Rich, thank you for joining and helping us walk through this one.
You bet.
And next up, we've got our good friend Katie Lannan to talk about what's ahead for the state budget. Earlier this summer, when the state legislature passed the budget and the governor signed it into law, there were asterisks, footnotes, caveats perhaps. The upshot of those seemed to be that things in Massachusetts state finances could go from okay to terrible this year with very little warning. Today, we're joined by BFF of the pod, Katie Lannan, also her day job, reporter for GBH News, to tell us how worried we should be and about what. Katie, thanks for joining us.
Always glad to, bring the storm clouds to a horse race.
Thank you. So I have to say up front, for full transparency, the last time you and I had this conversation was on a tiki boat in Boston Harbor. This time, we're back on dry land and ready to dig in.
Yeah, not a tiki drink in sight.
I feel like I should give no more context to that introduction and just leave it there.
I think that was perfect. I can't imagine anyone having any questions. It is at least as, stable sounding as the budget discussion we're about to have.
Great. So in all seriousness, you said some things which caught my attention and reminded me that after the budget passed, we never really dug into the very unusual set of circumstances that legislators were working with this year. So help me break this down, and let's start at the beginning. So in an average year, one long ago, say 2023 or so, a lot of the budget was sort of set, right? So some numbers would come from the feds, some would come from other places, and budget writers would have a lot that they could just sort of plug in. But this year, there's a lot more uncertainty, right?
Yeah, uncertainty was really the buzzword of the whole budget process from the outset. I mean, regular horse race listeners will know that budgeting is a months-long, if not full-year process on Beacon Hill as of late. The process really kicks off in earnest in around December and January when the administration and legislative budget writers huddle to hear from experts on their forecasts for the year ahead and agree how much revenue they can plan to collect over the coming fiscal year. And that includes the big revenue number includes federal funding. It includes state tax collections. It includes a specific on how much is going to come in on that special surtax on people who earn over $1 million or so as a household. So they kind of agree on all these numbers and then start building the budget based off those estimates.
So then let's focus on this year, because this year it seemed like there was a lot more ambiguity about particularly the numbers that we were getting from the federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. The final figure that this budget is based around is that there will be somewhere in the neighborhood of $16 billion from the federal government. We don't know really because so much is tied up in courts. We've seen Andrea Campbell, the state attorney general, sue over some of this federal funding that has been put on hold or clawed back. We don't know ultimately how Massachusetts state tax collections are going to go if we see major job losses across, say, healthcare, clean energy, higher education, what that'll mean for state tax collections. And the tariffs have been another piece of this. The whole idea of what is the broader economic impact of the Trump White House and the Trump policies going to be is something that economists and policymakers and budget writers have been trying to get their handle on this whole time. And now we have a state budget in place, but we still don't necessarily have answers to all of those questions.
So it sounds like you're saying there are sort of two buckets. One is the federal government gives us a certain amount of money usually, and we kind of know how much that's going to be. And the other is we have to predict how much taxes we're going to take in based on how we think the economy is going to be doing, which is always a bit uncertain. But let's zero in on the first one of those buckets if we could, because it seems like this year there's a lot more uncertainty even about the basic number of like how much the federal government is actually going to give us.
Yeah, and part of that comes down to timing. Governor Healey signed this year's budget into law on the 4th of July, pretty much in tandem with President Trump signing the budget bill that had been moving through Congress, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. State lawmakers will like to say that their budget is the Big Beautiful Bill, so if you can really get into a branding war there. But either way, that federal piece of legislation has the potential to have a lot of downstream impacts on the Massachusetts budget when you talk about cuts to food assistance, when you talk about cuts to Medicaid. MassHealth, the state Medicaid program, is the single biggest piece of the state budget. So not all of the cuts take effect immediately. There are going to be many that come into play years down the road, but we've already seen, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation is estimating that this fiscal year alone, the MassHealth changes could mean a $100 million hit to Massachusetts. We've heard from state officials across Beacon Hill that Massachusetts can't make up on its own the full scope of federal cuts that are likely to have an impact.
And that is this year, or that's in a couple of years when they fully take effect?
Yes. It's kind of throughout. We still don't really know how much we'll see from this year. There's talks about annual impacts for SNAP, the food assistance program, in the tens of $millions with the possibility for a few years down the road, we'll be talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that Massachusetts could be on the hook for. So there's kind of shorter term concerns and longer term projections.
Okay, and I want to put this in scope for a second, because you mentioned one number, which was $16 billion, which is how much money Massachusetts gets from the federal government. How much in the scope of the whole state budget is that?
We're talking about a roughly $60 billion state budget this year, so it's a substantial portion of it. When you get down into these numbers, like we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars here, $100 million here, lawmakers tried to give themselves some wiggle room in that budget by building in a cushion of sorts of $800 million, which sounds like a lot of money. It's almost $1 billion. That's revenue that they anticipate collecting but haven't budgeted, so that if there are $100 million in mass health cuts that the state needs to make up for, they can theoretically pull from that pool of money. But when you start talking about $100 million at a time, that $800 million could go pretty quickly.
Okay, so I want to then look at what the actual impacts would be to people in Massachusetts if things like this were to happen. And starting with the near term, you mentioned SNAP, you mentioned other kinds of food assistance and some other programs that the Attorney General is currently suing over. What kinds of things would not happen? What kinds of programs would basically just end or be underfunded if the One Big Beautiful Bill stands, for example, in all of its elaborate detail, and the funding streams for Massachusetts basically disappear or dry up?
So overall, I will say that big picture, Governor Healy and state budget writers say they want to protect the most vulnerable, the people who are sick, who have disabilities, who can't feed their families for whatever reason. Those are the areas where state government has kind of telegraphed they want to prioritize their resources. So we don't know necessarily what their fixes might look like. The Greater Boston Food Bank has estimated that food banks and food pantries across Massachusetts would need somewhere around $119 million to meet the increased need if SNAP benefits diminish. There are really big projections of a couple 100,000 people at a time losing mass health coverage, losing their health insurance under the changes to Medicaid. And we've heard from a lot of people in the healthcare realm and in state government that it's not just about those few 100,000 people's health insurance. That's how hospitals get paid. And if a hospital can't pay its bills, are we going to see more hospital closures? Are we going to see longer wait times for specialists or primary care providers? They say there's a real potential for the broader healthcare system across Massachusetts to be affected.
Let's dig in then on Medicaid, because you noted that this is the biggest piece of the state budget here in Massachusetts. It's also would be by far the largest cut that the One Big Beautiful Bill contemplates. It's not all in place right now. Of course, this would unfold over the next couple of years. But if it were to go the way that the bill projects, or that is kind of contemplated in the bill, how big of a problem would it be for the Massachusetts state budget?
The word that we kept hearing, even as this state budget was being written, before we knew where Congress would ultimately land, was devastating. And we've seen Governor Healy come out just today, right before we started taping, marking the anniversary of the creation of the Medicaid program, by saying that Massachusetts really will stand up to its commitment to health care. We don't know at this point here in July what that's going to ultimately look like, if there are going to need to be cuts elsewhere in the budget to make that happen, what kind of changes might be on the line, what levers there are really for state government to pull.
How much money would actually be at stake here, looking specifically at the Medicaid funds that we get from the federal government?
Healy's office said back in May that Massachusetts could stand to lose somewhere around $1.75 billion for Mass Health and for the state's Health Connector insurance program. So that's not a small amount of money. That alone is bigger than that $800 million cushion that budget writers wrote in.
Right. It feels in some ways like the legislature is saying we can do this if we have to in a lot of ways, because honestly, what else are they going to say? But the size of these holes, the depth of these holes is massive. And if things kind of go the way that they could, they're much too deep to just fill with a little bit here and there. You'd have to do something like raise taxes or, as you note, cutting services elsewhere. Is that fair?
Yeah. And really, if we see a dramatic funding loss, a need to make cuts, if the state budget falls out of balance because of this during this current fiscal year between now and next July, it's going to be Governor Healy who has the first move to make here. She's the one who has the authority and the responsibility to make cuts from a large swath of the state budget to bring it back into balance if there isn't enough money to go around. Now, she's actually asking the lawmakers to give her a little bit more power to expand her budget cutting authority so it covers all of state government, not just the executive branch that's under her purview. She wants to extend it to those kind of quasi-public state agencies, as they're known in jargon, as well.
So we'd be talking about things like the MBTA and other authorities that aren't actually part of just the departments that are within the executive branch.
Right. Right now, it's anyone who, the governor is their direct boss. She can cut their budget. But it would also extend to the legislature, the constitutional offices of the attorney general and the state auditor, which is something a lot of eyebrows have been raised about on Beacon Hill. But the governor herself says she's mostly looking at those quasi-public authorities and agencies rather than the other constitutional officers. Now, that doesn't seem like something the legislature is super jazzed about. They don't necessarily want to give up their power of the purse there and give the governor more authority. They like to hold on to their power. That's any politician does. So if that doesn't take hold, there's still probably going to be a few months from now, at some point down the line, difficult spending decisions that have to be made. We've already seen in the budget negotiation process that the chief legislative negotiators decided to use more of that millionaire's tax money than they were originally planning on this year to give themselves a bigger pool of money to play with.
So we're talking about very important programs to people's everyday lives and the possibility of budget cuts elsewhere. Looking ahead, if this were to happen this fiscal year or even next fiscal year, what will the signs be that the wheels on the wagon are starting to wobble and roll away?
Yeah, I think we'll be watching for the monthly revenue collection totals as those come in to see if the tax revenue that the state is bringing in is where it's projected, because even, like you said, there are those two buckets. There's the federal funding and there's the state level revenue collections. And, if state revenue collections go great, maybe the federal funding isn't as much a concern. Maybe there's more wiggle room. I don't think there are a lot of economists projecting right now that things would go great on that front, but we'll see what happens. We'll be watching those numbers. And we'll also be looking for instances where there are state agencies or other entities that are having trouble paying their bills. It's kind of a common practice for the legislature to need to go back throughout the course of the year to add more money to certain accounts, especially ones that are driven by how much caseload demand there is. So if we see, for instance, increased state spending outside of what's already been projected. The shelter system is a great example of that, right? They've had to keep pouring money into the shelter system over the past few years. If other state spending like that continues to rise, that's kind of another warning flag as we wait for these federal funding numbers, because the less revenue the state brings in, the more state spending there is. That kind of sets up a situation where federal cuts could have a greater impact.
And it sounds like from what you've told me that we could start to get answers on this pretty soon, right?
So back when Governor Healy signed the budget at the start of July, her budget chief, Matt Gorkowitz, basically said that it would probably take him about a month to unwind the impacts of the big, beautiful bill and really know what Massachusetts is on the hook for here. We're coming up on about a month since he said that, so maybe we'll have an indication soon.
Well, for all you listeners out there, if you want to follow along on this and know before others do what's going on, you should follow along with the reporting that Katie does. She's at GBH News, so check her out there. Katie Lannan, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. The MassINC Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massincpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week comes to us from our local feline elections department here at the horse race. Very large, well-staffed, large data viz and analysis sections of that particular department. For this segment, I've also asked Katie Lannan to stick around because she has a cat and is an expert in such things. So just to set the scene a little bit, the residents along the Somerville community bike path have started an informal bit of hilarity, which is the campaign for the bike path mayor, which apparently is going to go to one of these cats, this non-existent fun office. So Katie, you have a cat. You're an expert in such things, right?
My cat would probably dispute that I am an expert in really anything, including feeding him every time he demands, letting him out as he'd like. If he had the opportunity to reign over a bike path, I'm sure he would gladly take it.
You should put him in the race. I think he'd be good at this job.
I think he would be good at maybe swatting down the competition on the campaign trail, but it does sound like a pretty heated field out there with Orange Cat, Barry. There's even some dogs in the race.
So this report, this exclusive hard-hitting report, comes to us from WRAL.com. So go there, check it out. There are sign wars. There's, of course, polling. There's lots of, national election experts weighing in on who's going to be the Somerville Community Bike Path mayor.
And puns aplenty.
The race has gotten catty, according to this website. For now, that is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Koczela. Jen will be back next week. Our producer, as always, is Charlie Koczela. Thank you to Rich Parr and Katie Lannan for joining us this week. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now to help others find us. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the MassINC Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.